by the time we hear this story, as the story of Jesus, Jesus is well on his way to Jerusalem. We've been saying that repeatedly because it is very important for us to realize that this latter part of Luke's gospel tells us the story of Jesus even as he is making his journey toward what he is, by this time, understanding will probably not turn out well for him. All the while he's been teaching, all the while he's been doing wonderful works, we would call them wonderful works of mercy, healing, touching people, bringing them in from the margins of society. But you see, we see these as good things because we seek to follow Jesus. But in reality, in the time of Jesus, this was being seen as rather rebellious, as overturning the established order of things. And that's why Jesus by now is figuring out, given the opposition that he is facing from the Pharisees, the scribes, the leaders of his time, that things are not going well for him once he gets to the capital city. But those words that Jesus preached and those things that Jesus did, well, that's what gave him his authority. In fact, it's what caused the people to want to follow him. And so it is no wonder by this time, after having journeyed all through Palestine, what we call the Holy Land, and teaching and doing his marvelous works of mercy, people are wanting to be around Jesus. And so Luke begins today's little story by saying, there was a great crowd around Jesus, and Jesus turned to them and said. And what's happening here is what we might proverbially say, or metaphorically say, a slap in the head. Because people were following Jesus largely because he was rather a charismatic teacher. By now we know that. His words also had meaning because he didn't only talk the talk. He did things that were thoroughly consistent with the message that he gave. And this was probably something that was different in the time of Jesus and set him out from all the other teachers who wanted to follow him, particularly those who found his words very attractive. Now, the people in power, the people who had all of the political power of the day, probably didn't find him very attractive at all. In fact, they found him rather suspicious. So these people are probably the people who were following him because he is saying things that makes them feel good. And he is doing things that heal their lives, make them whole again. And who would want to follow someone like that? But you see, Jesus is saying something to them. He's saying to them that, yes, all of this is very attractive to you. All of this is very feel-good. But you see, there is a cost to be paid. This doesn't come simply because I'm here. Jesus, as we mentioned already, is on his way to Jerusalem, and he has a pretty good idea of what's going to happen to him. The people have no idea. But Jesus, being the savvy politician and rabbi and teacher that he was, probably knew very well it would not go well for him. And so he's saying to them, if you want all of this, if you want what I have, like that movie a few years ago, I'll have what she's having. Well, people wanted what Jesus had. He's saying, it just doesn't come. Because what I'm talking to you about is the kingdom of God. That these things, words of mine, describe a social order which is rooted in the heart and mind of God. And this kingdom of God of which I speak, and which gives power to do the healing and the reconciling that I have been doing among you, there is a cost attached to that. And the cost is this, that the world in which you move and live every day, that world doesn't care about you. That world doesn't care whether you're sick or at the margins of society. That world only cares about power, and it only cares about money. And what I'm doing may actually disrupt the world in which you are living. And so it may also disrupt the relationships that you have with people. Jesus was a savvy teacher. The style of the rabbis of the day. And one of the ways in which the rabbis taught was by, we might call it, hyperbolic language, exaggerated language. And so when we hear Jesus say something like, unless you hate your mother and your father, your brothers and your sisters, your friends, your colleagues, your neighbors, you cannot be my disciple. That doesn't sound like the God of love, like the Lord of love, the good shepherd that we talk about all the time. No, it sounds quite opposite. And Jesus intended that. He did not tell us to hate them. That's not what he is saying. Read it carefully. What he's saying is that there may come a time where if you choose to follow me and follow the path that I walk, there will be division between you and those you hold dear. And unless you are ready to accept that division, unless you are ready to accept that this might be the price for what you seek, unless you're willing to pay that price, then you can't be my disciple. Because the things that I offer call for a way of life that is very different from the life that you've been living in the world in which you find yourself. The values of the kingdom of God very often upturn the values of the world. We're seeing it all around us today. For some reason, something has happened among us where the veil of domesticity, the veil of civility has been ripped off of everything, and now it's just dog eat dog. If you want to get ahead in the world, you have to put everybody down and push everybody aside. That is the reality of the world in which we live. It always has been, and it always will be. But what Jesus is saying is that that isn't the way of God. That is not what God intends for the world. That is not what God intends for you. And so if you, in your heart of hearts, want what God intends, then you must be ready to give all that up. Because that is not the way of God. So essentially what Jesus is saying to us today is that we need to look at our hearts and see where we place our treasure. He has said this before, over and over again, in so many different ways. Now he's saying it with that proverbial slap up against the head, saying, don't get all wrapped up in my wonderful words and teaching and all the wonderful things that I do. Because, in fact, those things are not the ways of the world. And if you love the ways of this world, you cannot be my disciple. Jesus is calling us to examine our hearts. Jesus is calling us to look at our own consciences and say, where are our values? Where do they come from? Are they the values of the kingdom of God? Are they the way of love? Not love which is sentimental and warm and fuzzy, but the harsh, self-giving love that led to the cross. Is that where your heart is? And once you see where your heart is, then you need to figure out what choices you will make. Will you choose to follow Jesus? Or will you choose to remain in the world and of the world? And once you make that choice, Jesus is telling us, well, then you need to commit yourself totally, completely, because otherwise the cost is way too great. Jesus is calling us to examine ourselves, to count the cost, and then to commit. That is discipleship, plain and simple. What is it that Jesus teaches? What is it that Jesus requires of us? It isn't to hate our family. It isn't to hate our friends. It isn't to hate our colleagues and neighbors. Quite the opposite. He is calling us to love them. Love them with that radical kind of love that gives of our total self. And in fact, if that demands that there is a division between those whom we hold dear, then so be it. Now that's a harsh message. And it's a hard message to accept. Because somehow we think we're all supposed to be nice to each other. Well, you've heard me speak of the tyranny of nice before. It isn't about being nice. It is about being civil. And it is about being kind. But what we make our ultimate choices about is really what Jesus is describing today. Will you choose the ways of the world, or will you choose the ways of the kingdom? Moses puts it a different way in that first lesson. He says, choose life or choose death. It's up to you. It's a binary choice when it comes to that. It's black and white. We tend to have to live our lives in the area between, in that gray area. And that's what makes it so difficult for us to figure out. But once in a while, Jesus tells it like it is, like Moses. And he says, you must choose between God and the world. Which will you choose? What will you do in your life? How will you order things in your family, among your friends, even in your finances? How will you accumulate things? And for what reason? And for what purpose? And how will you use the resources that God has given to you? How will these things add to others who are around us, so that they hear the words of Jesus and see his mighty works and realize that they're not just nice things, but rather they are meant to change and transform the world in which we live? That's what Jesus is talking about. To go deeper, to go deeply enough that we can change the world. Where is your heart? Examine. How will you choose? Count the costs. And then commit yourself today to a renewed world. A world that is filled with grace and peace. A world that can only come from God.